That was a great morning and three great papers. But they haven't so far generated many questions. We've got a couple of comments on David Omissi's paper, but only one question so far. So could you keep those questions coming, please, or get them coming? Get started. Anyway, we'll start with the question on David Omissi's paper. The question is, you mentioned Auchinleck didn't consider the RAF as suitable for policing internally in India. Considering the RAF's experience in imperial policing in the interwar period, was it not relatively easy for the organisational shift from conventional warfare to internal policing, if required?
The policing in the 1920s and 1930s, the policing in the 1920s and 1930s would be mainly on the northwest frontier, and the policing that was required in some of the disturbances in India in 1946 onwards was not entirely, but often in urban areas, would have been very difficult to police from the air. But also mentioned that there was a reluctance, a political reluctance to use air power. I think I mentioned there's a squadron of Tempest with the Punjab boundary force. They would have been effective, but there was a reluctance to use them for political reasons.
Thank you. I should have mentioned that question was from Lewis Osborne. Any more questions, please? Please generate some questions from this wonderful panel. I've got a question for Meor Azalan, which is about secrecy and censorship. And this might apply to other speakers as well. How far, the RAF wants to project a certain kind of image, doesn't it? Do you think the operations it's conducting in Malaya are surrounded by a certain amount of secrecy and censorship?
First and foremost, thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak. Thank you, David, both Davids, David squared. I think in terms, I think I'll tend to agree with what we've heard from the first two speakers as well. What we're speaking about here today is a sensitive sort of period of transition. It includes moments of management away from colonization into native control, native independence, and so we heard from Indonesia, and I mean the story there is interesting as well. My feeling is the attempts, at least with the Malayan Emergency, the attempts to unify and centralize some efforts come with it unavoidable instances where one might be able to say that secrecy was the priority instead of obtaining the truth and so on. However, in these instances, I think in hindsight we can learn to sort of understand that it all falls under sort of like it's sort of like the moment itself, which is a management away from quite literally the world has changed, which is again the point of this conference, to sort of dissect the actual moment and how it was experienced, not just by those in Europe, for example, but those away in the East Indies and as well in Malaya. So I think in terms of the level of secrecy, and I know again Mountbatten himself was good with this. I mean, we hear good stories about him, we hear good stories about Templar, but we also hear not so great ones about Mountbatten and also Templar as well. But in any case, I think it would be convenient to point to the fog of war, but you take it with a pinch of salt. So secrecy, yes, of course, it's slightly uncomfortable to realize that perhaps some of these things were being done without the knowledge of almost anyone. But in any case, again, with hindsight, it's easy to judge, morally judge. But I'm not in the business of sort of making those moral considerations, at least for today.
Thank you very much. We've got some questions in the room, apparently. So can we go to those?
Yes,
Ari?
I'd like to ask a question about the effect of the end of Land Lease on the aircraft that were available to the RAF. This came up yesterday in the case of the carrier aircraft that were thrown over the side of ships. It's a well-known case. And the argument was that by the end of 46, I think it was, there were no Land Lease aircraft on board British carriers, at least in the Pacific Fleet. You've two of you have mentioned the use of US aircraft. I think certainly one of you has. I wondered if people know exactly what the effect of the ending of Land Lease was. Was there a certain amount of time during which the RAF could continue to use these aircraft? Was there a new arrangement for continued use in these special circumstances? It's obviously a very general question that, given the topic of the entire conference, it would be useful to have some clarity on.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay. I think it's fair to say there's considerable concern that the Americans will take a dim view of the use of aircraft like the P-47 to suppress a rising nationalist movement. But there is, in fact, slightly less concern in the United States. I think partly a recognition that this wouldn't be happening had it not been down to MacArthur reconfiguring Southeast Asia Command's responsibilities. And there is a little more willingness to accept the return of the Dutch to sort out Indonesia. And when I say sort this out, I don't mean in terms of the police actions they subsequently conduct, but in terms of maintaining law and order, so you can have some sort of transition to a democratic government. So but there is a degree of concern. There's also an awareness that the RAF wishes to re-equip. Now, David's mentioned the Tempest, and of course the Hawker Tempest Mark II, that's the one with the radial engine, the Centaurus. Forgive the spot a moment. That starts to come on stream as well. So you're starting to see the ability to replace some of these aeroplanes with British-produced aircraft, which ultimately, of course, is what happens by the time we get to the Malayan Emergency. The P-47s are all gone. The RAF's P-51 force, which is Europe, that's also gone as well. So Britain can maintain that air strength from within its own resources by 46, 47. Some of the aircraft, of course, do not have, say, the load carrying capability of aircraft like the P-47. The Mosquito is starting to show slightly alarming signs of coming unglued when the weather gets too hot. And ultimately, its replacement, the de Havilland Hornet, in 1955, I think it's 45 Squadron, where here Jeff Jefford would confirm or correct me. But they have to withdraw those aircraft because they're being eaten by termites. Because, again, they're from the wooden-based construction. But despite those problems, the RAF can provide sufficient aircraft to meet its needs from its own resources, not least, of course, because you have a huge number of pretty advanced aircraft like the Spitfire, the Tempest Mark VI, Tempest II, all of which have been planned for production for the Second World War or for the final throes of it, that have been ordered, they've been built, and they can be brought into service. So that's how they replace the American aircraft, and the UK sourced aircraft are appropriate for the task at hand. But it does, of course, cause some concern, but it's mainly a political concern about how what we now call the optics, in that terrible phrase, of using US-made aircraft to suppress an independence movement. How will that look? As I say, there's brief concern, but there's a certain amount of tolerance, not least because of the fact it becomes clear the British are not trying to reimpose traditional colonialism on the Netherlands, East Indies. They're there to maintain the status quo until the Dutch and the Indonesians can sort this out.
Okay, thanks. And there are another couple of questions in the room. When you ask a question in the room, could you say who you are, please? And I don't know how I go to one rather than the other, but perhaps you could. Would someone who in the room who's got a question like to do now?
Thank you, Chair. My name's Gary Willis. I've got a question for Dr. Azalan. I'm an environmental historian with a particular interest in the environmental impact of warfare. And firstly, on your sources, I'd be really interested if you could say a little about where you found your information and whether on the British side there are potentially valuable documents which have either mysteriously disappeared or are still officially withheld? And also, do you know, has any work been done on the long-term impact on Malaysia's ecology of this aspect of Britain's military past? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think this goes back to the method of the research. I was lucky enough to be able to spend some time at the National Archive before the world closed, in some ways. There was a lot of detective work, I reckon. But I think the issue here is that often with work like this, you're constantly chasing an incomplete sort of picture until or as and when the right sort of paper trail shows up. It's the same, I suppose, with memoirs, especially with memoirs from native sources. With regards to British sources, there's still quite a fair bit of work to be doing, to do at the archive, I assume. But the ones which I did come across, again, the information was bits and pieces, more like collated sort of reports from other departments sent to a different department and so on. But in any case, I assume most of these things must have, if not destroyed, certainly there's some trails out there which we can pick up on. The issue is, of course, in the period of, post Malaysia gains independence in 1957, we're speaking about things occurring in 1952 onwards. So within the same sort of 10-year period. And we know recently from the Hounslow Park sort of revelations, at least 5 lorry loads of documents from Kuala Lumpur was sent to Singapore in 5 lorries and destroyed in an incinerator in Singapore. I'm not sure how much that plays into the overall picture we can sort of gain today. But my feeling is, as more and more of these documents come out, as more and more sort of memoirs perhaps come out. But then again, I mean, memoirs. Keep in mind that these individuals are past their sort of age where I assume memoirs tend to come out. I mean, some of them have passed, have died, and it's quite unfortunate. But in any case, I think the efforts continue. So as much as possible, I would like to continue and spend more time at the archive, of course. And in terms of, to answer your second question, in terms of safety, in the same file which the trial results came out, there were some letters of complaints from, off the top of my head, if I'm not mistaken, complaints from nurses, just sort of warning the effects of, I think the effects of Trioxone and how it, the reaction to staff members being asked to conduct the trials, again, is a subset which is interesting, which can be nested within the research. It's environmental history itself as a field is new, and I'm very excited to contribute to this field of environmental history, especially in war, with regards to both the contemporaneous sort of effect of these chemicals, but also the long-term effects of spraying in places like Ulu Langat, in places like Belum, Kampung Belum, and so on. So I think the future looks positive for me, at least, and I appreciate your interest over the subject. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. I'm told that there's time for only one more question, and we've got several waiting in the Ask a Question section, which I don't think we're going to have time to go to, because there is one more question from the floor to come, and I think this will have to be the last one. So would the person who's got a question on the floor like to say who they are?
My name is Seb Brooks. I'm the head of the Air Historical Branch. Just a brief comment on the classification issue. It was pretty routine in the Air Force to classify anything that was operational as secret. So unless the files on Trioxone were classified as top secret, I don't think they'd have been considered. And of course, at the time, there wasn't quite the same sensitivity that has developed since, particularly post-Vietnam with Agent Orange. It's likely that it was simply regarded as an operational matter, and therefore the classification secret would be normal. If it was top secret, that would indicate that they're much more concerned about it. I have a quick question for both the Davids. To David Jordan, you talked about replacing P-47s with Tempest, etc. But what about the Dakota squadrons? What about 31 Squadron? Because did the RAF purchase those Dakotas that they were still flying post-war? So that's my very quick question to you. And to David Omissi, my quick question to you is, you quoted Wavell on his concerns at the RAF's handling of the mutinies in the Far East, but I think the RAF was principal. It recognised the fact that one of the principal causes of the mutiny was the fact that the RAF was flying all the army back home to be demobilised, but the RAF needed the staging post to conduct that return of the POWs and the army units in particular from the Far East to be demobilised, and the RAF were thinking, well, what about us? So there's a recognition by Park and others that there was an element, if you like, of justification to it. So I believe I'm right in saying the only people they prosecuted in terms of court-martials were 5 card-carrying members of the Communist Party who were on a base outside Dry Road near Calcutta. And only one of those was sentenced to hard labour. The rest of them pretty much got wrapped over the knuckle. So I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on that, David. Thanks.
Shall I start with the Dakotas? Very straightforward. I mean, I'm always alarmed when you get asked a question by the head of the historical branch, which suggests you're about to reveal that you fouled up spectacularly in some of your factual understanding. But of course, the Royal Air Force does continue to operate a number of Dakotas for quite a long time. So a number of the American Dakotas are brought into UK service because of their value as transport aircraft. I think it's one of the rare instances of the Royal Air Force actually recognising the importance of air mobility and investing some cash, a cynic might say. So yes, you do see the arrival of the Dakota, but of course over time, my understanding is that yes, they purchase a certain number of Dakotas. Obviously, they don't purchase every single one of these precious assets. But until you start to see the arrival of dedicated transport aircraft, obviously you have aircraft like the York from UK sources, but the Dakota fulfills a need which can't be bridged, because the UK is focused, of course, as you know, on building fighters and bombers. So you have to splash some cash, as it were, on US assets until you can then build up a force of Yorks, Lancastrians, of course, from the civil sector, and then other aircraft, most obviously the Handley Page Hastings when that comes into use. So you have a small force that is bought out of necessity, because without that, you don't have the air transport capability that the RAF needs in the post-war environment.
And there is a reference from Auchinleck when he's talking about shortage of transport aircraft, saying in India the conditions are such that we prefer twin-engined aircraft because they're better suited to rugged airstrips. But the point you're making about some justification for the actions of the quote-unquote mutineers, they don't call them that, of course, except in private. But yes, there is some recognition of that. Also, that the RAF other ranks are concerned that the army people, as they're being demobilised, they're going to get the jobs when they go back. If you look at Vincent Orange's biography of Keith Park, it's quite an interesting discussion of Park's attitudes to the mutineers, and he does accept there is some justice to their actions. And yes, they are very reluctant to prosecute anyone. I think you're right in saying it's 5. There's 5 people, and one is Timberlist, yes, is sent to Hops.
So I've really enjoyed this morning. It's been a great panel with so many common themes and all focusing on the same period, same area. I think it worked very, very well. And I hope you enjoyed it too. And so I'd like to thank all the speakers very much, obviously. And I'd also like to thank Harry Raphael very much for organising this conference under very, very difficult circumstances. First time I've ever chaired anything virtually. I was a bit scared, but it seems to have worked reasonably okay from the point of view, well, very well from the point of view of the technology. So thank you for giving us such an enjoyable group of papers on little known areas. We've been getting some comments on the chat thing from people who say, you know, you'll be introducing them to an area they don't know anything about. So great morning. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Thank you, Wendy.